Thank you very much, Carolyn. I'd like to thank the Physiological Society, in particular Paul Greenhalgh, for the invitation to speak. It's fantastic to be back here in the East Midlands after being here on sabbatical for a year. It's a beautiful place. A model for phenotype in terms of hypertrophy could be stated as a product of both gene, external influences, and the interaction between these terms. The goal of my presentation today is to focus on three external factors that in some cases are believed, and in some cases I think the science supports their influence on the role of hypertrophy. So the external variables I'm going to talk about, the first one is dietary manipulation by protein. And the statement is that greater protein intake via supplementation is sufficient and necessary for greater gains in muscle mass. The second external variable I'll talk about is the manipulation of load. And the presupposition is that heavier weights are sufficient and necessary for inducing hypertrophy and gains in strength. Hormones, or the acute endogenous rise in hormones, have been said to be anabolic and are sufficient and necessary for the induction of hypertrophy and strength gains. And by way of introduction, what I'd like to do is to give you the definition, at least for this presentation, between belief versus evidence. So first of all, science, as you can see, is the process of understanding the world through experimentation and observation, whereas belief is an internally held understanding filtered through one's own worldviews. And so an unscientific belief would be something that is held as generalizable fact without substantial supporting evidence. However, Adam Smith said it a little better, science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition, which is a euphemism, of course, for belief. So protein supplementation. You've seen some of these graphs before, so I'm going to go through them fairly rapidly, but the regulation of muscle mass is determined by, and Phil Atherton gave you a little bit of insight into this yesterday, the ingestion of protein and the superimposition of load. So with each ingestion of protein, there's a transient rise in protein synthesis. It falls after a few hours, and then there's a transient rise. We get areas of net positive muscle protein balance, areas of net negative muscle protein balance, and intrinsically those areas are about even after we've finished growing. If you want to summarize this then, it's that variations in protein synthesis affect muscle mass, but the process is transient. So every 3 to 4 hours, the ingestion of food would put us into a state of positive balance. The situation's a little different when you impose resistive or loading exercise, in that each fed state period now is amplified and each fasted state period is smaller. So we get a net accretion of muscle protein over the period in which resistance training is occurring. So feeding-induced changes in protein synthesis, are enhanced by resistance exercise, and the process is quite long-lasting. So resistance exercise in and of itself is fundamentally anabolic. One of the first questions we posed a number of years ago now was to look at what load or dose of protein was optimal to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And these are data generated by Dan Moore, now a professor at U of T, in which he showed that about 20 grams of protein was sufficient to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Now, there's obviously variability associated with this estimate dependent on your body mass. So if you're smaller, you need less, and if you're larger, you need more. Nonetheless, when you net this out, it comes out to about 1/4 gram of protein per kilogram per meal. And so you've probably seen some of the publications from our lab advocating for a per meal recommendation. I think a good proof of principle that we were on the right track was provided by Oliver Wittard and the group up at Stirling in this dose-response paper with whey protein, in which they had a unilateral exercise bout and essentially showed the same thing. So in other words, at 20 grams of protein, you got a stimulation of muscle protein synthesis more pronounced in the exercise leg than you did in the rested leg, but it wasn't further increased at 40 grams. So 2 independent labs, independent methods, and then obviously some general agreement. I think a further proof of principle that this sort of every 3 to 4 hours, 20 grams of protein was somewhat sufficient was provided by these data from Jose Arreta, a PhD student at the time with John Hawley and working with Louise Burke, in which The intermediate delivery of 20 grams of protein every 3 hours over a 12-hour period resulted in a net greater myofibrillar fractional synthetic rate. So this was a bolus dose, that was 2 times 40 grams, and this was 8 times 10 grams, so a pulse, a bolus versus an intermediate. So again, some proof of principle that this is making sense when we net it out over a day. So across the course of 12 hours, feeding per 3 hours a dose of around 20 grams was superior to feeding larger or smaller frequent meals to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. The model, however, has a big gray bubble in which you're in a net catabolic state, and that's obviously when we're sleeping. So we're not eating while we're sleeping unless you're obsessive about your eating, in which you would ingest food every 3 hours, and so an alarm would go off to remind you to do just that. A more practical strategy, however, has been the suggestion that a pre-sleep meal of protein to counteract this period of catabolism would be beneficial. I've not intentionally made it larger, but the estimates are that if you sleep for at least 8 hours, there's some evidence to suggest that a larger protein meal might be beneficial. I think the first proof of principle of this came from Peter Rez, a graduate student working with Luc van Loon, in which they had young men ingest 40 grams of protein, in this case it was casein, prior to sleep, and they showed that the overnight protein synthetic rate was indeed higher than in the placebo group. There are some practical implications of this. In a paper recently published by Tim Snyders, in which one group received a protein supplement before sleep, and you can see this is the placebo, this is the protein group, both before and after, and the quadriceps muscle cross-sectional area and the change shown here was greater in the protein supplemented group. You can see that there are some functional implications of this, and this is the sum of all of the 1RMs, and the increase was greater in the protein supplemented group. So the protein turnover measures from Rez do indeed bear out in terms of the implications on function shown here in the Snyder study. So pre-sleep protein consumption attenuates an overnight reduction in MPS, and it may facilitate recovery or tissue remodeling overnight. So it's a pretty practical strategy. I think the real question then becomes one of, does this really matter? Does protein really increase mass and strength? And so I can't be from McMaster and not talk about evidence-based answers to this. So, because McMaster, if you didn't know, was ostensibly the home of evidence-based medicine. And I'm going to rely on some data from the late Naomi Cermak when she was working with Luc van Loon. And this is a forest plot showing you the random effects meta-analysis on fat-free mass. You can see the search criteria in their paper. And that in younger and older individuals, you need the number of studies here to show you that the overall effect does favor protein. I want to point something out. This is the net increase that you see. So that would be about 1 kilo, so it's slightly less than 1 kilogram. But look at the number of studies in here that overlap the 0 confidence interval. So there's a lot of null findings out there. And if you look at the null findings, a lot of them come from very small, likely underpowered studies to detect this effect. So it's not until you do a meta-analysis that you can make this conclusion. There's a functional consequence to that as well. For the young and for the elderly, this is, I believe, run repetition max leg press here, and you can see that protein supplementation does have a functional effect. So protein supplementation does augment hypertrophy, so it's both sufficient and necessary, but the effect is pretty small. I think if you go back and you plot that difference as a percentage of the gains in muscle mass made, you can see that just lifting weights is the predominant driver, and the protein augments the response, but not by an awful lot. So what about external load as a driver? Rob Morton stole some of my thunder this morning, so that's okay because he did a fantastic job. The current guidelines are essentially these. This is the principle of what a lot of people would call specificity. If you want to get stronger, you lift heavy loads. If you want to hypertrophy, you lift moderate loads. And if you want just endurance, then you lift in this type of range. And you can do as many sets as you want. The general sort of paradigm is that none of these studies, or very few of them, have taken the lifting of the load in any of those situations to failure. You can always do more work when you lift a lighter load. That's just the reality of lifting loads in this range. So this strength specificity continuum is something that forms a number of guidelines. Now, there are a number of studies on which this is based, but it all drills down to really, and I don't want to say but there are really about 2 to 3 studies on which these guidelines are based. This is one from Campos, and they had a low, an intermediate, and a high rep group here. These were work matched. So in other words, the high rep group did not perform contractions to fatigue. They were matched to the low rep group here. And you can see then what you would expect. The strength gains are, yes, they're significant, but they're greatest in the low rep or the heavy group, and they're somewhat in between in the intermediate rep. It's the same for the squat and leg extension you can see here. I don't like to present tables, but if you look here, these are the pre to post values for type 1, 2A, and 2B fibers. There's a control group here. Hypertrophy to the same degree in the low and the intermediate rep. It's there in the high rep, but it's not statistically significant. So maybe this is one of the key studies. Or if you drill right back into the literature, maybe it's this study. And if anybody knows who that is, congratulations. That's Thomas DeLorme. He published a paper in 1946. A highlight from Mike Joyner, the date here, 1946, and to prove to people in the audience that weren't around in 1946 that some good science was being done here. The title of the paper was Heavy Resistance Exercises. I love that title. I'd love to have a paper with that title. And what he wrote was, most injuries of the trunk and extremities, because remember, he in 1946 was interested in rehabilitating soldiers who had come back from the Second World War, result in atrophy to varying degrees. And the redevelopment of what he called muscle power, which is really, he was talking about muscle strength, is the most important factor in restoring normal function. And the principle of heavy resistance and low repetition exercise was better for developing muscular power than exercises such as stationary cycling, which primarily build endurance. And this paper forms the foundation of a lot of people's understanding and insistence that heavy loads are the most important thing that be done. He concluded, rather than attempt to develop endurance in atrophied, weakened muscle, it's more logical to restore muscle strength to normal and then build endurance by means of low resistance, high repetition exercises. So even there, you can see the genesis of this idea. So is the paradigm really correct? Does external load drive hypertrophy? Well, again, our thought was that at momentary muscular failure or fatigue, all motor units would have to be recruited. That's the definition of how the size principle works. So the first one to challenge this was Nick Bird. This is a paper he published in PLOS. I do believe it's probably it's about the 4th most viewed physiology paper in PLOS One. Very proud of that fact and proud of Nick, obviously, for generating this work. And it was essentially the work that started it all. So we did 90% of 1RM to failure, 30% of 1RM to failure, and then a 30% work matched to the 90 fail group. So you can always do more work at the low load. This is the mixed muscle fractional synthetic rate, 90 fail, 30 fail, 4 hours and 24 hours. This is a myofibrillar fraction. This is the slide that Rob showed to show you that at 24 hours, in fact, the 30 fail group was still elevated, whereas the 90 fail group was back down, and this is the sarcoplasmic fraction. So this is the protein turnover data then that we're trying to sort of look at as proof of principle that low loads are, if not at least equivalent, maybe even mildly superior to heavy loads. So the conclusion of this paper was that the results suggest that low load, high volume resistance exercise is more effective in inducing acute muscle anabolism than high load, low volume, or work match resistance exercise. We published that paper, and my email inbox filled up with hate mail from a lot of people. The pundits that I care about these days extend beyond grant reviewers and journal reviewers to social media. This is what the masses out there had to say. It's just MPS, it's not actual hypertrophy. Good point. Who lifts at 30%? You're not going to get stronger that way. Also, good point. So, enter Cam Mitchell. The overall purpose of the present study to test whether the acute results we had observed previously would be reflected in longer-term resistance training adaptations. So resistance training at 30% of 1 RM to fatigue versus 80%, we lowered the load a little bit to make it sustainable, to fatigue, and comparing the adaptations. This is the quadriceps volume change. I could show you quadriceps muscle cross-sectional area. It's exactly the same, but no difference between the two groups. If you look at the strength, however, here's where you begin to see some differences. So this is voluntary isotonic 1 RM here. You get stronger lifting at 30%, but you get stronger still lifting at 80%. It makes sense. If you're going to lift and test somebody lifting a 1 RM, and you're lifting at 80% on a regular basis, you're only 20% away from your 1 RM. Here, you're 70% away. So if you only test 1 RM pre and post-intervention, then why shouldn't the group that practices closer to their 1 RM get better at doing it? So neurologically, it makes sense. If, however, you give them an unpracticed task, this is isometric torque, they gain the same. So a large part, I think, of the underpinning of you get stronger doing this is that you practice lifting loads that are closer to the test that you use to determine strength. So in accordance with our previous acute measures of muscle protein synthesis, rates at a lower load lifted to failure resulted in similar hypertrophy as a heavy load lifted to failure. From Twitter and Facebook, it was a unilateral design. Who cares? Clearly these are from people who have never had to deal with small amounts of grant funding and design studies that are easier to do, but there you go. These were naive, untrained subjects. They respond to everything. I had to look the next one up. These are noob gains with a Z. That means these are gains made in people who are new to resistance exercise, but there you go. Noob gains, that's all I got in an email, and I was like, what the heck? I have 3 young sons. I thought I was fairly savvy with these things, and they didn't even know what noob gains was. So C, lifting at 30%, you don't get as strong, so who cares? So as Rob presented this morning, we conducted a study in which we had trained participants, so they wouldn't get noob gains. They had a non-unilateral design with groups of sufficient power to detect differences and making people as strong as we could using a lower load or a higher load, but all of the things lifted to fatigue. And as I said to my students, we had a number of discussions going into this. I said, we're never going to please everybody. Sorry, but this is what we're going to do. So Ciro Oikawa and Rob Morton were the drivers behind this. Trained young men, 25 per group, matched for strength and lean mass, trained using low rep, high rep, sets to fatigue, strength testing every 3 weeks, so we give everybody a chance to get better at their 1 RM. Biopsy, DEXA, hormonal measurements pre and post training, as you've seen from Rob's talk this morning. Same results, good to know they don't change. Lean mass gains, and I apologize for the graph here, it doesn't really show you, but significant in both groups, no difference between the heavy and the light, the high and the low repetition. Same results for the fiber area, same results for the strength, with the exception of bench press here, and I believe the difference was about 4 kilos between these two, but it was significant, which speaks to the size of the sample that we used in the ability to pick up something that small, I think. So, but every other lift there, no difference between the groups. So resistance exercise determines neither hypertrophy nor strength gains in trained young men. So there was no differences in lean mass, no differences in muscle cross-sectional area, and no differences in gains between fiber types. So the answer is, does it really all matter? And this is, for those of you who don't know, is Brad Schoenfeld. Brad is at Lehman College in New York City. And Brad does a lot of work in the strength and conditioning field, and he's done a lot of meta-analyses looking at how external variables like volume and load and intensity affect muscle hypertrophy. So an evidence-based answer that he gave, and this is a meta-analysis in training with higher loads versus lighter loads, is that higher loads tend to lead to greater strength gains. You can see that the confidence interval overlaps 0. And my point is here is that there's a lot of null findings there are a few that tend to the right. So what I'm going to do is superimpose the Morton data right here, and I'll show you that that's the answer, which wasn't available at the time when you include the Morton data, which from an evidence-based standpoint, I think says that as long as you give people a chance to lift heavy loads at one time, which is what a 1RM is, then they get equivalently strong. At the same time, training with heavier loads, Brad concluded, tends to lead to greater hypertrophy. It's really all because of this one study that drives everything to the right here. Everything else you can see squarely overlaps the 0 here. But when you add the Morton data, the answer is there's no difference. So heavier loads are neither required nor necessary for strength gains or for hypertrophy. Well, what about endogenous hormonal responses? Again, Rob stole some of my thunder here, but the hormone hypothesis basically says that the resistance exercise-induced testosterone, free testosterone, growth hormone, IGF-1, et cetera, is responsible for hypertrophy. This is a quote from the Essentials of Strength and Conditioning, where it says that exercise prescription can enable hormones to mediate optimal adaptations to resistance exercise. Wrong one, sorry. Resistance exercise-induced hormonal responses potentiate strength and muscle mass gains following long-term training. And I'm not cherry-picking quotes. The literature is absolutely full of these types of statements. We employed a model, this was a number of years ago, Sarah Wilkinson in my lab, of unilateral training, where we just trained one leg, and as the red implies, one leg got bigger and the other one doesn't change. There's the cross-sectional area determined by CT scans. This is muscle fiber cross-sectional area changes, and these are the hormonal changes, okay? So no difference between the two conditions and no rise in hormones. So you don't require hormones to get hypertrophy. They don't have to go up. We went and looked at a plausible mechanism. So we went to the stable isotope approach. We wanted to look at muscle protein turnover, and we used a model in which we just exercised the elbow flexors, or we exercised the elbow flexors after having performed a very heavy leg workout. And so we elevated endogenous hormones to the levels that they would be elevated after a resistance exercise workout. And for those of you who work in the area, you'll often see as a piece of advice, do your smaller muscles like your arms after your legs, because they'll be bathed in anabolic hormones. This is the rise in testosterone in the high hormone and cortisol in the low hormone, so no change. This is muscle protein synthesis. No difference between the two conditions. Not convinced, it's just the acute hormonal response. Does it work in the real world? Repeated the study in a training fashion. Here's the serum testosterone in the arm-leg condition, elevation, decline, arm only, no change. There's the net area under the curve. There's the cross-sectional area change, no different. Excuse me, I should mention the strength changes. I could show you a number of things, fiber, muscle, it doesn't matter. They're no different between the two. I could show you it for growth hormone, for IGF-1, for free testosterone, nothing. Real world gains. This is what I'm told we need to look at all the time. So we dipped into the freezer. We had blood from this study. This was a study done by Joe Hartman in my lab. And you can see this is 56 young men completing the same training protocol. There are some differences in the protein levels that they got, but nonetheless, we thought that this would provide a proof of principle to show whether somebody at the low end versus the high end, and you'll notice, keep your eye on the blue dot here. He was a 0.1 kilogram gainer, or a hard gainer, versus 7.6. I compare that in 76-fold range to Claude was very excited to show you a 10-fold difference in VO2. Well, this is a 76-fold difference in hypertrophy. And this is the area under the curve for the free testosterone response of the low gainer versus the high gainer. They're about the same. There's some special people in here you can see, but they weren't the big gainers. Here's growth hormone. I could show you any hormone you want. I could show you any measure of strength. There's no relationship between the two. So the acute post-exercise rise in systemic hormone concentrations, things like testosterone, growth hormone, and IGF-1, are not important in stimulating a rise in muscle protein synthesis, gains in lean mass, or increments in strength. So I've told you a number of things. First of all, greater protein intake as a supplement is sufficient, and it appears, based on the CERMAC meta-analysis, necessary for greater gains in muscle mass. Load, heavier weights are sufficient, but not necessary for inducing hypertrophy and gains in strength, and lighter weights develop more than just endurance. Finally, hormones, the acute post-exercise rise in anabolic hormones is neither sufficient nor necessary for the induction of hypertrophy and strength gains. So my take is that this model might be a little bit different than what we think. The external factors should maybe not be big E, but little e. So it might come down again to picking your parents wisely and making that the big G comes from somebody who can give you a good muscular response. But the impact of these in influencing hypertrophy is, I think, much smaller, provided there's a sufficient training stimulus. Thank you very much.